Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Nolene Duff and I'm the chair of the panel of administrators here at the City of Casey, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the City of Casey Council meeting on the 13th of December 2022. We've got a bit of background noise there, but anyway, we might just close one of the doors if we may. Thank you. I'd like to start with introductions and introducing the panel of administrators. So good afternoon, Mr. Cameron Boardman.
Good afternoon, Chair.
And Mr. Miguel Belmar.
Good afternoon, Chair.
And we're joined this afternoon by a number of council officers, most notably our Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Glenn Patterson, and we're joined by Jen Bednar, who's the Director Customer and Business Transformation, James Collins, Director of City Planning and Infrastructure. We have Ms. Holly de Kretzer, who's the Acting Director Corporate Services, and Callum Patty, Director Community Life. And we're supported this afternoon in AV by Simon and also our Governance Support Officer, Ms. Nicole Rode. Thank you for your assistance. The Statement of Acknowledgement, item 1.1. The City of Casey proudly acknowledges the traditional owners, Casey's Aboriginal communities and their rich culture, and pays respect to the elders past, present and future. We acknowledge Aboriginal people as Australia's first peoples and as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we work and live. The Diversity Statement. City of Casey is home to remarkable diversity with many cultures, languages, faiths and communities of worship, ages, LGBTQI+ identities and landscapes, together forming our rich and dynamic community story. From our first Australians to our most recent arrivals and every wave between, the City of Casey welcomes and represents all community members and their respective ambitions to live healthy, rewarding and happy lives. We recognise this diversity as our strength and we aim to share, nurture and celebrate it. Item 2 is the confirmation of minutes, and there's one previous set of minutes to be confirmed this afternoon, those being for the council meeting on the 15th of November 2022. Do I have a mover and a seconder to confirm the minutes of that meeting?
Yes, I'll move those.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. And a seconder?
Seconded, Chair.
Mr. Boardman, all in favour? Carried. Item 3, declaration of interests. I've considered my obligations under Section 130 of the Local Government Act 2020 and do not have a conflict of interest relevant to any item on this afternoon's agenda. Do my colleague administrators or any officers have conflicts to declare?
I've got nothing to declare, Chair.
Nothing to declare.
Nothing to note, thank you. I now move to item 4, public question time. And we have received 55 public questions submitted through Council's website for this afternoon's council meeting. The first one is concerning the Berwick Springs toilet blocks, and the remaining questions are with respect to an item on tonight's agenda, item 5.1, the Hampton Park Hill Development Plan submissions to the public consultation process. So I'll start with question 1, and that is tabled by Mr. Michael Ball, and the subject is the Berwick Springs Wetland Reserve West Playground Renewal Project. And Mr. Ball's question is, in 2016, Council proposed a toilet block at Berwick Springs Playground. Following a residents' petition, the project was cancelled. Mayor and Ward Councillor Sam Aziz assured residents this would not be proposed again. A new playground upgrade incorporates a toilet block. 80 residents have signed a new petition. Will Council commit to the 2016 assurance from the then Mayor and remove the toilet block from any future draft or master plans? Can Council assure residents this will not go ahead against their wishes? And in response, the advice I have from the Manager City and Asset Planning is that in 2016, following consultation and considerable support for inclusion of a toilet facility within the Berwick Springs Wetland Reserve, Council adopted the Berwick Springs Reserve Master Plan. This master plan depicts inclusion of a public toilet in a location near to the Berwick Springs West playground. In late 2016, when Council sought to implement projects identified in the master plan, there were objections lodged by some residents and the proposed public toilet was not pursued at that time. As part of park improvements proposed in 2018, consultation was undertaken and again support was provided for provision of a public toilet at the reserve. In 2022, and as part of the proposed renewal works to the Berwick Springs West playground, Council has undertaken stage 1 of community consultation. An accessible public toilet, barbecue and picnic shelter are proposed as part of the scope of works. Council is currently reviewing feedback received as part of this consultation. A petition has been lodged with Council detailing concern over the proposed toilet, and this will be tabled at the first Council meeting in 2023. Further consideration of all submissions received will inform stage 2, which involves development of a draft concept design. So thank you, Mr. Ball, for that question. With respect to the remaining 54 questions submitted, and I do note that we've included questions that were sent in and received by Council as late as today, the remaining public questions highlight concerns and questions that form submissions to the public consultation on the proposed Hampton Park Hill Development Plan. 1,068 submissions have been received in response to the public consultation. The consultation was open from the 6th of July 2022 to the 14th of August 2022, a period of 6 weeks. The purpose of item 5.1 on the Council agenda this afternoon is to acknowledge receipt of those submissions. A Council decision on the draft development plan and a detailed response to those submissions will occur at a future Council meeting in 2023. The public questions have been grouped this afternoon into key themes, and so there are 12 key themes that the responses, to enable us to facilitate as much of a response to those 54 questions as we can in the time available this afternoon. So general responses are being provided at this point, as the submissions are currently subject to detailed review and will be responded to within the future Council report to be presented in 2023. There will be some repetition in the answers and in some of the questions. So what I'll do is I'll outline each of the summarised questions, and the submitters' plural names will be included, and then I'm going to seek the assistance of Mr. James Collins, our Director of City Planning and Infrastructure, who will respond to each of the questions as I pose them. So the first group of questions is obviously the Hampton Park Hill Development Plan, submitted by Mark Roberto, Margie Raman, John Quiros, Deborah McCoy, Parvinder Tatria, Lisa S., Lyndon Samuel, Trudy Quiros, Raymond Daly, Annette Samuel, Ryan Halkett, Kim Murphy, Brianna Nish and Tobias Villagran. And the question is, I'm a City of Casey resident landowner and am impacted by odour traffic noise generated from the Hallam Road landfill. As an impacted resident landowner, I'm part of the community that should have been consulted, given opportunities to raise questions on the proposal for the site. I became aware of the proposal from other impacted residents. I'd like to ask why the Council didn't include all the impacted residents, landowners, in the awareness consultation process. Mr. Collins?
So the Council report and attached details, it outlines the community and stakeholder engagement process that was undertaken for the draft development plan, which used a variety of engagement techniques. This has resulted in a high level of feedback. During the public consultation period, Council received 5,458 visits to the Hampton Park Hill Casey Conversations page. We had 348 downloads of the draft development plan. We had 151 downloads of the frequently asked questions. We also included the frequently asked questions in a mail out of 2,600 directly to impacted stakeholders. Council officers attended online consultation forums, stakeholder briefings and a public meeting with approximately 200 residents in attendance. Council received 1,068 submissions, which represents a significant level of community awareness and comment.
Thank you, Mr Collins. The next question relates to the buffer overlays, and the submitters of this question is Peter Maund, Lorraine Prattley, Ashley Liang, Michael Isle, Shannon Lynch and Tobias Villagran. And the question grouping is several members of the community have asked questions regarding the scale and appropriateness of the identified buffer zone scale, proximity to residential development and impact on neighbouring home values. Mr Collins?
So the EPA already applies a default buffer of 500 metres to the landfill outside of the planning scheme via BPEM 788.3, siting, design, operation and rehabilitation of landfills. So the Planning and Environment Act 1987 imposes an obligation on the planning authority, which in this case is us, to map hazards and identify land use risks where the information is known and available. So the proposed development plan does not itself introduce a buffer overlay into the planning scheme. This is identified as a separate future process that Council may choose to undertake at a later date. A recommendation in today's Council report is to provide a copy of the community engagement summary to the relevant state ministers, which includes the community's concerns with the buffer area overlay, a new tool that's been introduced by the state government in March 2021. And they're suggesting it to be used to map existing EPA recommended buffers around the perimeter of landfills. So Council's consideration of these issues and determining the Council's position on the proposed development plan, with or without changes, will occur at a future Council meeting.
Thank you, Mr Collins. The further questions are with respect to the waste transfer facility, and those submitters include Mark Roberto, Margie Raman, John Quiros, Deborah McCoy, Parvinder Tatria, Lisa S., Lyndon Samuel, Trudy Quiros, Keith Dobbin, Evelyn Alexelis, Karen Young, Daphne Trey, Apostolos Savidis, Peter Lawson, Patricia Rivers, Daphne Trey, Evelyn Fernandez, Troy Van Gorp, Evelyn Alexelis, Chris Lucy, Ashley Liang, Ashish Kumar Naik and Julianne Nanbu. And that grouping of questions is a number of questions have been received regarding the suitability of the waste transfer location, the controls and impact of noise, traffic, odour resulting from the transfer site. Mr Collins?
So the Victorian State Government has identified the precinct at a state level significant waste and resource recovery site through their statewide waste and resource recovery implementation plan. So the Hallam Road Hub Plan, which was part of the Metropolitan Waste and Recovery Group in 2021, requires that consideration be given to a commercial waste transfer facility on the site. A waste transfer facility on the site will require separate planning, building and EPA approvals. These approvals would consider the detailed design, the construction, the operation of the facility, and including amenity, environmental and risk assessments, conditions and monitoring mechanisms to ensure compliance with the state laws and obviously the standards. So this, once again, will be considered as part of Council's position on the proposed development plan, with or without changes in the near future.
Thank you. Next question is with respect to waste-related emergencies, and the submitters that have raised issues around this theme are Rowan Dixon, Amanda Haslam, Annette Samuel, Michael Isle, Kim Murphy and Jan Woodrow. And the question grouping is a number of residents submitted questions regarding the responsibility for emergency planning and seeking to understand what plans are in place to deal with waste-related emergencies, e.g. fires, access to the site by emergency vehicles and gas-related incidents. Mr Collins?
So the waste and landfill activities are governed by both planning permits and the EPA licences. So the planning permits issued for the site refer to and rely upon the compliance with the EPA operating licence. The site's operating licence is under the Environment Protection legislation, which was issued by and is overseen by the EPA. The EPA is the regulatory authority responsible for compliance, the monitoring and enforcement of the Environment Protection Act in 2017. Any waste transfer facility on the site would require separate planning and building and EPA approvals. These approvals would consider detailed design, construction and operation, as I've outlined before, and they have to ensure they have compliance with the state laws and standards.
Thank you. The next questions are relating to the existing permits and powers, and the submitters who've raised inquiries about this question are Evelyn Fernandez, Ashish Kumar Naik, Amit Bansal, Kathy Perry, Ryan Halkett and Rekha Mohan. Several submitters made inquiries regarding the current operator's permit and powers Council holds for enforcement of permit conditions. Mr. Collins?
So as stated in my previous response, the existing landfill activities are governed by planning permits and the EPA licences. So the planning permits issued for the site refer to and rely upon the compliance with the EPA operating licence. So the site has to operate under this licence, which is overseen by the EPA. They are the authority responsible for the compliance, monitoring and enforcement of the Act. Council and the EPA regularly engage to ensure a coordinated compliance and monitoring approach to the management of landfills and other licences, including the one on Hampton Park Hill.
Thank you. The next question is about the rezoning of land, and the submitter was Liz Wagstaff. As an extremely concerned resident, is it morally or in fact legally permissible to retrospectively change the zoning of a property to accommodate the proposed development plan? Which authority will be responsible to compensate property owners for their homes? Mr. Collins?
So the proposed development plan does not rezone or introduce a buffer overlay into the KC planning scheme. This is identified as a separate process that Council may choose to undertake at a later date. This may form part of any future planning scheme amendment process where further opportunities will be provided to the community to participate.
The further question from Liz Wagstaff is with respect to alternate waste solutions to landfills. And the question is, why in 2022 are we burying rubbish at Hallam Road landfill? Can't we burn waste to produce energy like the Scandinavians do? That solves two problems, eliminates the need for a smelly landfill and saves us burning coal or gas to make electricity. Mr. Collins?
The landfill has a current planning permit to accept waste until 2040. However, at the current tipping rates, it's expected to reach capacity around 2032. The Victorian State Government has identified the precinct as a state-level significant waste and recovery site through the State Waste and Recovery Implementation Plan. The Hallam Road Hub Plan identifies existing and potential uses which are needed for state, regional and local waste and resource recovery facilities. The proposed development plan seeks to facilitate these state and metropolitan strategies for ongoing waste and recovery and circular economy principles on the site. So a waste transfer facility is a response to moving away from landfill as the method of disposing of residential waste. A transfer station would act to consolidate waste before it's transferred off-site to an advanced waste processing facility.
Thank you. The next question is with regard to responsibilities of council, and the submitters are Abi Subramanian, Rowan Dixon, John Theodoridis and Shannon Lynch. Questions regarding the onus of responsibility for impacts resulting from the development plan and waste transfer site were received. Mr. Collins?
Council has a responsibility to consider the state government policy and direction and the KC planning scheme when preparing development plans. The Victorian State Government has identified the precinct as a state-level significant waste and recovery site through the State Waste and Recovery and Resource Recovery Implementation Plan. The existing development plan does not reflect current state government policy or future land uses for this precinct and is required to be updated. A waste transfer facility on site would require separate planning, building and EPA approvals. The responsible authorities for these approvals would consider the detailed design, construction and operation of the facility, including amenity, environmental and risk assessments, conditions and monitoring mechanisms to ensure compliance with state and state laws and standards. Council will consider these issues and determine its position on the proposed development plan with or without changes once all submissions have been reviewed, and will present to Council for consideration at a future Council meeting in 2023.
Thank you. The next question is from Bernadette Dixon, and it's with regard to the new EPA draft guidelines for consultation. Is Council aware that earlier this week the EPA released 2 new draft guidelines for landfill buffer zones? The consultation can be found, and it cites the website location. And the title of the document is New Guidelines for Industry Separation Distances and Landfill Buffers. The most notable is to the Hallam Road landfill, with the EPA's aim to extend the buffer zone for landfill accepting municipal putrescible waste from 500 to 1,500 metres. Given the Hampton Park Hill development plan stipulates a 500 metre buffer overlay and to be retrospectively applied to the Section 32, does the Council intend amending the development plan to incorporate the proposed EPA guideline of a 1,500 metre buffer overlay? As materials and waste can be harmful to human health, damage the natural environment and or impact on amenity, the system, which is regulated by the EPA, must operate to minimise these risks. And that quotes the 2018 document. Mr Collins?
So Council is aware the EPA released last week new draft guidelines and will consider these documents in determining Council's position on the proposed development plan. The community is encouraged to also review and provide feedback to the EPA on the draft guidelines. So the Planning and Environment Act 1987 imposes an obligation on the planning authority, which is us, to map hazards and identify land use risks where the information is known and available. The proposed development plan does not introduce a buffer overlay into the KC planning scheme. This is identified as a separate process that Council may choose to undertake.
Thank you. And the final question is from Karen Young, Daphne Trey, Arby Subramanian, Bernadette Dixon, Raji Raju and Alan Curfey. And the question is, residents have inquired about the support in place to mitigate health and wellbeing impacts as a result of the waste transfer station and development plan. Mr Collins.
So Council will consider these issues when they determine their position on the proposed development plan with or without changes in a future Council meeting. However, these matters are likely to be considered at a planning permit application stage via conditions and be subject to the EPA requirements and approvals and form part of the operator's emergency management plans and may be outside the scope of the proposed development plan process.
Thank you, Mr Collins, and thank you for your assistance this afternoon. I do thank the submitters for their questions, and the council officers will note those questions as part of the work that they do in analysing further the submissions that have been received, and will aim to respond to those further matters in the council report, which they'll present to the panel of administrators in early 2023. So thank you. Now move on to item 5, officer reports, and we have 10 reports this afternoon. The first of those reports is item 5.1, Hampton Park Hill Development Plan submissions to public consultation. And we have a recommendation in the papers. Do I have a mover for that recommendation?
Chair, I would like to move an amendment to that recommendation in my name.
Or an alternate recommendation?
Alternative recommendation.
Yep. Please, could you just go through the changes? Is that now on the screen, if we can have that on the screen? Thank you, Mr Boardman. Over to you.
So for the purpose of completeness, I will read the proposed new recommendation in its entirety, but before I do that, I will surmise that to points 1, 2 and 3, there are no changes. I am seeking to insert new point 4, new point 5 and current point 4. There are no changes, which will become new point 6. So as I said, Chair, for the purpose of completeness, I will move the recommendation in my name and read it in its totality. That I move that Council, 1, acknowledge and thank all submitters for their participation in the engagement process and the submissions lodged in response to the public consultation of the draft Hampton Park Hill Development Plan. 2, note the advice from the Metropolitan Waste and Resource Recovery Group and Sustainability Victoria that the draft Hampton Park Hill Development Plan is generally consistent with state government policy, which identifies the Hampton Park Hill precinct as a state-level significant waste and resource recovery site in the statewide Waste and Resource Recovery Implementation Plan, SWRIP 2018. The SWRIP 2018 is a document referred in the Casey planning scheme for which Council, as the responsible authority, must have regard to in its statutory decision-making. 3, write to the Honourable Ingrid Stitt MP, Minister for Environment, and the Honourable Sonia Kilkenny MP, Minister for Planning, providing a copy of the Community Engagement Summary Report, Attachment 1, and highlighting the submissions relating to state policy, including A, the designation of the site as a hub of state significance under the SWRIP 2018, B, the Hallam Road Hub Plan, brackets Metropolitan Waste and Resource Recovery Group 2021, close brackets, which requires that Council strategic planning includes consideration to a commercial waste transfer facility within the precinct. C, the use of the buffer area overlay, brackets a new tool introduced by the state government in March 2021, close bracket, proposed to map the existing Environment Protection Authority, brackets EPA, close brackets, recommended buffers around the perimeter of the landfill. 4, seek written confirmation from the Honourable Ingrid Stitt MP, Minister for Environment, and the Honourable Sonia Kilkenny MP, Minister for Planning, on the state government's policy position, including the proposed Victorian Recycling Infrastructure Plan, on the designation of the Hampton Park Hill Development Plan precinct for ongoing waste and resource recovery, the use of the buffer area overlay and the recently released EPA draft separation distance guidelines, which is publication 1949, and requests that the state government confirms if it has any intention of reviewing such policy positions in the near future that may result in a conflict with the proposed development plan. 5, requests the head of Recycling Victoria, consistent with sections 37E, subsections 1 and 2, Environment Legislation Amendment, Circular Economy and Other Matters Act 2022, consult with the City of Casey in regards to the development of the draft inaugural Victorian Recycling Infrastructure Plan and provide a copy. And 6, note that Council officers are reviewing submissions and a report will be presented to Council in 2023 to consider submissions and endorsement of the Hampton Park Hill Development Plan with or without changes. And I'll move that recommendation in my name.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. Do I have a seconder?
Yes, I'll second that.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. Mr Boardman, I invite you to speak to your motion.
Chair, I will talk to the proposed amendment specifically and commence by acknowledging comments that you made in your opening remarks regarding the public question process and also answers provided by Mr Collins, which broadly cover a number of themes which were highlighted in the engagement process, considering the current status of the buffer zone, noise, traffic and odour from the site, emergency planning access issues, existing permits, powers of the council, zoning related matters, waste to energy consideration, onus of responsibilities as it relates to the plan and any impacts from that. There was a reference and question to the EPA draft guidelines, which are now referenced in my amendment, and issues surrounding health mitigations, which I think we can sum up, Chair, as the broad themes that have been identified in the consultation, engagement and reports. And I do bring to attention of people in the gallery and those who are watching online quite a substantial document that's in front of me, which is the council papers for this meeting, which includes not just the summary report from the independent consultant that council engaged to conduct the consultation activities in relation to this proposed development plan, but all the submissions received by us, all 1,068 of them received by us in relation to this matter. And I will confirm to the audience and to those online, and I'm sure that this is completely consistent with my co-administrators and council officers, that we have taken the time to read every single one of those submissions because we understand the importance of this matter, we understand the consistency of the community feedback, and we understand the impact that a decision of this significance will potentially have on those living within this area and further afield. But I do want to just start with a quick historical overlay, which does give some relevance and some context to why we are discussing the consultation activities. And I do stress that we are not here to make a decision tonight on the development plan. We are here to discuss the consultation activities and the result of that engagement and the process that I have outlined in my amendment on seeking further clarification from the state government on their longer term plans, which will have a significant impact on the decision that we will make at a point in time, which may be next year. And the reason why we are taking significant time, not just to engage with the community, but to fully evaluate and consider all these issues, is we've got to think back to 2018 and what happened under what was called the National Sword Policy of the People's Republic of China, when they decided to not accept any waste material from any developed country. And at that stage, Australia was exporting over 619,000 tonnes of waste to China for recycling. And literally, within the space of 3 months, that stopped. And that caused an issue for not just the municipality of Casey and the state, but the whole country and many other countries, that 619,000 tonnes of formerly exportable and growing at roughly 15% per annum waste needed to be transferred, needed to be managed, needed to be recycled, needed to be dealt with domestically. And that was a consequence of the Victorian government's policy, and I'm not here to advocate or endorse the Victorian government's policy, but they did introduce in 2021 the Circular Economy Waste Reduction and Recycling Act, which specified the quality and the performance expectations of councils in regards to what was the new structure of waste, dealing with the four aspects of waste which was going to be separated, which included the introduction of a separate glass service to manage and to collect and recycle glass products by 2027, and a separate food organics and garden organics process by 2030. Now, this is quite significant for the decision that we need to make, because this has required not just this municipality, but every municipality in the state to rethink what is going to happen with waste. How we're going to collect it, how it's going to be transferred, how it's going to be recycled, not just consistent with the statutory obligations under this Act, but how is it consistent with the national obligations? And this is a pretty critical challenge for all of us. So if we think back to where we are in the process in 2021, which coincided with the introduction of the new legislative process, the Victorian Planning Authority issued a grants round to provide funding for councils to look at development plans as it related to waste collection recycling precincts. And we applied under this particular grants round. We were motivated by two things. One was obviously the introduction of the new legislation and how the Hampton Park Hill precinct would fit into the new legislative requirements, but also the identification of what's a substantial asset within the City of Casey and the potential for that particular site to be used for other economic and investment purposes. And we were successful with the VPA's application to receive funding to develop this development plan, and hence this is where we are today in the process. But we've also got to note that since 2021, there has been introduction of additional legislation, which actually received royal assent on the 6th of September 2022. So we're only talking a few months ago, and that occurred only a few months before the state election. We acknowledge that the election has come and gone, that the Andrews government has been returned, but there obviously was a process around caretaker, which means that government can't enact anything that comes out of legislation until the election process is completed. But the Environment Legislation Amendment, Circular Economy and Other Matters Act of 2022 was introduced and, as I said, received royal assent on the 6th of September 2022 and came into effect. And one of the purposes of this particular piece of legislation, and why this is so critical to the decision that we will have to make at a point in time, is that it introduced an amendment to the referenced Act, the Circular Economy Waste Reduction and Recycling Act, to introduce a single Victorian recycling infrastructure plan, to establish a waste to energy scheme, to provide for powers relating to the circular economy market powers, including powers relating to risk, consequence and contingency planning for the circular economy, to further provide for matters relating to compliance and enforcement, and to make other miscellaneous minor and technical amendments to that Act. So In 2021, the state government introduced legislation which was primarily in response to the decision that China took to not accept any of Australia, and for that matter Victoria's, waste, that was further amended only a matter of months ago to introduce and require Recycling Victoria to develop a single Victorian recycling infrastructure plan. And as Mr Collins has answered, and as we have been quite clear throughout this process, and it is clearly articulated in the public documents that we have made available for tonight's meeting, we have an obligation to comply with all the legislative requirements that the state government ensures councils must comply with regarding recycling and waste management. And this is an example of that obligation and why it is so critical. The amendment in my name is seeking further clarification from the relevant ministers as to the status of the proposed and soon to be developed Victorian recycling infrastructure plan. I just want to also make it very clear that under this new Act, the objectives of the plan are to provide long-term strategic planning to guide and inform decision-making in relation to waste, recycling and resource recovery infrastructure at state, regional and local levels. And also to enable waste, recycling and resource recovery infrastructure planning to be informed appropriately by land use, development planning and policy, environmental regulation approvals and policies, transport planning and policies, and to support risk consequence contingency planning for the waste, recycling and resource recovery infrastructure work, and to provide a long-term strategic planning framework in relation to Victoria's waste, recycling and resource recovery infrastructure needs for a period of 30 years. So the new Act provides the basis of this issue to being considered on a statewide basis. It is not a decision, irrespective that the City of Casey is the planning authority in this case, that we can consider unilaterally without taking consideration of what are the statewide priorities of the state government, what are the legislative obligations under those two critical pieces of legislation that I have referenced, and to ensure that we are, as the correct and appropriate planning authority, meeting those obligations. So whilst we have engaged in a consultation process, and we accept that there are some members of the community which don't believe that that consultation process was adequate, I think, as Mr Collins has articulated, that when we have nearly 5,500 visitors to the conversation page, we have 348 downloads of the draft development plan, we've had 151 downloads of the FAQs, we've had 2,600 letters mailed out. We've received, as we've stated, 1,068 submissions. We've had a number of questions which we have read out, collated and provided hopefully some degree of clarification and answers to tonight, and we will undertake to write back to all of those submitters and questioners to provide them with answers around their specific issues. It does show that there is certainly concern and interest in this matter. It does show that the consultation process has been extensive and has certainly provided some significant feedback and information for us to consider this issue on a wider basis. But it also does provide us with a significant degree of clarity over our statutory responsibility, not just as it relates to the current legislation, but what will happen in the future. So the amendment, Chair, that I have moved is dealing with that matter specifically. Whilst we will be writing to the relevant ministers and providing them with advice around the results of the engagement process, which is consistent with our statutory obligations, we also need to get clarification from the state government as to the timing of the new VRIP, as the acronym is now known, and also to ensure that we are part of that process. This is the key point that I want to make this afternoon, is that this is not a decision that can be made unilateral to what is going to happen on a statewide basis, and we want to be part of that process. Because if we look at section 37E, subsections 1 and 2 of the 2022 Act, the head of Recycling Victoria does not, under our interpretation of the Act, need to consult with us. He or she has discretion on who he or she may consult with. We want to ensure that we are absolutely at that table advocating on behalf of our residents and ensuring that all of the issues around this site, as raised quite legitimately and thoroughly through the consultation exercise, are fed into the development of the new statewide plan. So with those comments, Chair, I do want to make it very clear again that we are not making the decision on the development plan tonight. We're acknowledging the consultation. We're acknowledging the submissions we've received. We have hopefully explained our role in this process. But I trust through my explanation, Chair, that I've given the residents some understanding and confidence around the statutory environment that we are a critical part of. And we hopefully are representing those views by seeking the feedback and writing to the ministers around what will be the VRIP development over the next few months, and that we will continue to seek clarification from the state, represent the views of our community in that process, and come back to this forum appropriately in the new year or at an appropriate time with an updated recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman, and thank you for the thought and analysis that you've given to your amendment there. Can I now move to Mr. Belmar?
Thank you, Chair. And firstly, I apologise if some of what my comments in seconding this motion are repetitive, but I think it's important in exercising my independent discretion that I also set out the basis upon which I am seconding this motion. The first point where I want to begin is really where Mr. Boardman ended, and that is that we are not making a final decision this evening. What we are doing is, as set out in the motion that we are moving, we're firstly acknowledging and thanking submitters for their participation and engagement in this process, and importantly, we are undertaking the process of further communicating with the relevant ministers to seek their information and their input as to the further and ongoing intentions of the new government. It's also important to consider that the motion that we are moving this evening is slightly altered from the motion that was originally in the notice papers. And that is because the motion has been amended to include a reference to a piece of legislation, which is a new piece of legislation, which creates the Office of the Head of Recycling Victoria, and we're seeking their input as well into our role. I'm not going to cover again the material that Mr. Boardman has traversed with respect to the reasons that we are in this situation, but they are historic and they are well known. And as a planning authority, as the relevant planning authority, we've got a responsibility to engage with the issue and to address the statutory powers that we have. And in doing that, it's appropriate that we correspond with all the relevant authorities that can assist us in this. And I note that we've had advice from the Metropolitan Waste and Recovery Resource Group, we've had advice from Sustainability Victoria, and also we are continuing to obtain advice and to have communication with the EPA. So on each of those points, I am confident and satisfied that the appropriate work is being undertaken to ensure that we have the appropriate information so that at a time in 2023, council officers are furnished with all the necessary information that they require to prepare a report which will come back to us and give us the information we need to then make a further decision with respect to the development plan as has been exhibited. So we are undertaking a step in that process, and I want to be absolutely clear about that we are undertaking a step in that process and that my mind is not closed in any way to a future decision. We are obtaining information, and when the appropriate time comes, I will consider, as my colleagues will consider, all of that information. In doing that, I want to note as well and be clear about the fact that as well as considering the submissions from local residents, I note that in the bundle of information this evening, as well as those submissions from local residents, there are also submissions from local commercial landholders, including from Viola, and it's appropriate to note that all of that information is information which we will consider. So it's the entirety of the community, which also includes organisations, commercial organisations that are providing information, and it is relevant that we consider all of that material. And I want to be absolutely clear about that. All of that material that is in the documents, it's appropriate that we consider all of it. Now, I just want to close by just confirming a couple of things, and my apologies again, Chair, if it's slightly repetitive, but I just want to be clear about the fact that on the issue of the proposed buffers, that is a matter that occurs under relevant legislation, that being the Planning and Environment Act, which imposes obligations on us as a planning authority to map hazards and identify land use risks when that information is known and available, and noting that the development plan does not introduce a buffer overlay into the Casey planning scheme, and if that is to occur, that is a separate process. I also note a second issue, and that is an issue that's been identified, that being that there will be a reduction in open space. And I want to be clear that with the advice that we have obtained, that the proposed development plan shows over 84 hectares of future land for open space, and that's been secured with agreements with relevant landowners if that is to go ahead in the future. I also want to note that the current open space catchment analysis indicates the proposed development plan open space land is more than sufficient to meet the future needs of the community. In closing, I want to confirm again that we are aware of guidelines that have been recently circulated by the EPA with respect to their work being done on buffers. We are aware of recent legislation that has been referred to in our motion this evening. And what that really tells me and informs me about is that a planning decision is a dynamic decision, and it needs to be made on the best available information at the time. And in coming to a decision, we need to weigh up competing interests and come to a decision that is the best decision that we can come to based on the information available. And I'm confident that at this moment in time, we are undertaking that process of informing ourselves so that at a future time we'll be able to properly weigh up competing interests, and there's no doubt they are competing interests, and make the best informed decision that we can make as a council. And with those comments, I'm happy to second this motion.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar, and thank you both for the comprehensive commentary that you've made, providing the rationale for your thinking and decision making. So I'll put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Thank you. We move to item 5.2, which is the Collison Estate Community Consultation and Planning Scheme Amendment, C286 to the Casey Planning Scheme, implementation of the planning framework for Collison Estate. There is a recommendation. Do I have a mover for the recommendation?
Yes, I will move that.
Thank you, Mr. Belmar. And a seconder?
Seconded, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Boardman. Mr. Belmar.
Thank you, Chair. In moving this motion tonight, I'm noting that the motion that is available on the council website and in the papers this evening consists of 4 parts, and it, if I can summarise it, it notes that there's been a preliminary community consultation with respect to a draft final Collison Estate Development Plan. Secondly, it updates the draft Collison Estate Development Contribution Plan prior to exhibition as Amendment C286 case, that being to the Casey Planning Scheme. It resolves to prepare Amendment C286 to the Casey Planning Scheme to enable the implementation of the draft final Collison Estate Development Contribution Plan. And fourthly, it requests the Minister for Planning to authorise the preparation of the exhibition of Amendment C286. Tonight, Council is continuing the journey of the adequate planning for the Collison Estate. I note that one of the things we did during one of the little gaps in the lockdowns of 2020 and 2021 was that we had the opportunity to visit the Collison Estate together with council officers who were able to provide us with a history, background and full information about that estate. having been on the ground and having a clear memory of that site visit, it's appropriate that we move the motion that we are moving tonight and asking the Minister to undertake the process of assisting us in a planning scheme amendment. What the C286 the planning scheme amendment seeks to do is to introduce a development contribution plan overlay to incorporate the draft final DCP, to rezone 1 Heather Grove, Cranbourne East to facilitate commercial development, to update Casey's activity centre work plan to include the proposed local neighbourhood activity centre, and finally to amend Schedule 22 of the development plan overlay and the schedule to the native vegetation planning provision. Attached to the bundle of documents this evening are a number of documents which include the relevant Collison Estate Development Plan. That's a document that I have read and considered, and primarily what that document seeks to do, Chair, in my review of the document, is to ensure that in future proper and fundamental works are able to be undertaken at that estate to ensure that appropriate drainage and roads are built and constructed to an appropriate standard, to ensure that in future, if other development can occur on that site, the fundamental work has been undertaken. It's a great opportunity that site presents, and I'm not making any final decisions or any conclusions tonight about what that might be in the future, but it's appropriate that Council, as the responsible planning authority for that part of Casey, undertakes this work and ensure that all land within the City of Casey that's available for development can be developed with the appropriate fundamental work that needs to occur. And with those comments, I am happy to move this motion.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. Mr Boardman.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr Belmar, for moving the recommendation, explaining its contents. I begin by referencing in the introduction of the development plan itself, which is on page 296 and page 297, or 298 to be specifically, in the attachments and the council papers, the aerial photograph taken of the Collison estate in 1991, so 30 years ago, vis-a-vis the aerial photograph taken in 2021, which clearly shows that development around the site has been completed at pace, but completely inconsistent to what the Collison estate actually is and remains today. We note, as Mr Belmar has articulated, that this again is not a decision on the future use of the site. There was significant engagement with the 73 landowners around the proposal for council to fund early delivery of infrastructure works, which included draining and also construction of 2 new sections of Collison Road. Unfortunately, the level of engagement received back from the current residents was insufficient for council to commence that, hence the reason why we are in a development plan situation at the moment. But we do note that of the 73 landowners who were specifically contacted in relation to the draft development plan, there was 52 submissions received, 28 supported, 9 objected, 8 supported with changes and 7 objected with changes, and a summation of the themes around the support or otherwise of the development plan is included in the council papers. And we also note that the draft development plan has been updated in response to some of the submissions, specifically the removal of non-residential uses preference along the south side of the estate, fronting Berry Cranbourne Road, and also the inclusion of a drainage channel being more accurately shown on the development plan, which is relevant to existing properties on the south side of the estate. So feedback from the residents who are impacted upon the development plan have been incorporated into the final plan which we're adopting tonight. However, as Mr Belmar has clearly articulated, this is not the final chapter in the Collison estate. There is a number of other matters which need to be dealt with, particularly as it relates to individual property holders and their desire for any future development of their individual and their abutting land holdings. And what the development plan does is provide guidelines and a structure around what those future uses will entail to ensure that there is consistency around the casing planning scheme, but also, importantly, consistency with what has happened to the areas surrounding the Collison estate, which are clearly articulated in the aerial photos which I have referenced. So, I'm pleased to second the recommendation as put and endorse the ongoing consultation engagement of council officers on this matter, which is scheduled to take some time, and that will be something that we will be updated with as it progresses.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. And just to reinforce, I know there's a member of the community here present this afternoon in the gallery who has some further questions, and the opportunity will be there in that future process to address those matters by submission to the planning scheme amendment process, which is the appropriate process to canvass any further detailed submissions. So with that, I'll put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried unanimously. Item 5.3 is the Bunjil Place Precinct Concept Master Plan and Community Engagement. Do I have a mover for the recommendation?
Chair, I will move that.
Thank you. We're now on to page 400 of the agenda for anybody who's following the page numbers. It is confusing. Thank you, Mr Boardman. And a seconder?
Yes, I'll second.
Mr Belmar. Mr Boardman.
Chair, this evening we're endorsing the undertaking of community engagement consistent with section 1142 of the Local Government Act 2020 on the draft Bunjil Place Precinct Concept Master Plan, which is represented in attachment 1, and I'll come to that in a moment. And noting that as part of that consultation there will be a report brought back to us in 2023 for further consideration. The background to this, that at our meeting of the 19th of July of this year, we noted a report on the revitalisation of the Fountain Gate and Narre Warren Metropolitan Activity Centre, which was a number of reports that we looked at our activity centres, so including Berwick, including Cranbourne, to look at how we could better utilise this space. I think we all acknowledge that this precinct is underutilised. This building itself, irrespective of its architectural splendour and acknowledgement that is received, has some challenges, and they were highlighted through the recent Archibald Prizes. We were quite impressed and at various stages overwhelmed with the number of visitors that we had to this precinct, many of whom, if not the overwhelming majority, were first-time visitors who remarked on a number of issues. One was that obviously how impressed they were with the building, but some of the themes that we received as feedback is that there would be a desire to stay longer, to experience other parts of this precinct and of the general area, and also the complete inadequacy that we had in providing food and beverage and hospitality services for that amount of people. And what it got us thinking is that there is a disconnect between Bunjil, between the Arc and between the Fountain Gate Shopping Centre. The space of land that separates this part of the precinct and Fountain Gate is primarily used for open parking, the Mac Falsley Reserve and the car park. And if we look at what we have included in the council papers through the draft concept plans, which we have commissioned to get the conversation started. These are not final plans at all. These are literally plans that have come up, been developed by MGS Architects and Taylor Cullity Lethlean Landscape Architects to generate discussion amongst the community on what we could potentially do with this precinct if the community so desired. And a couple of things have been identified. One is that there is potentially surplus land that the council could dispose of, or it could lease to one or more future owners and users of the precinct, and that we want to ensure that there is much better connectivity and flow through between the shopping centre, which may hopefully spur some future development of the shopping centre and the surrounding precincts. And I think we all acknowledge that there are parts of the surrounding precinct that could certainly be dealt spruce up, but to provide a reason for visitors to this precinct particularly if we are going to be utilising this precinct further in the future for major events and other community and cultural events, to stay longer, to invest in the community and provide an incentive for those that we're providing such services to develop accordingly and provide the facilities which we would be very confident that the community would expect and utilise quite thoroughly. So this is a conversation starter. It is a draft concept plan. It will go on public exhibition. There will be engagement from council officers with many different stakeholders who are currently owners of abutting land and potentially may be impacted positively, hopefully, or otherwise by the master plan if we do decide to endorse this in the future. But we very much want to get community feedback on what is the best future use of this part of the municipality of Casey. This is our civic hub, this is our cultural hub, this is the part that we want to ensure that we are bringing as many people as possible to enjoy, to participate, to be engaged with community activities, but we do want to give them some degree of economic, cultural, community and investment incentives to stay longer, to enjoy what we have to offer, but to future-proof it so that we are not being overtaken by other precincts, but we are providing all of those future uses and other services that the community expects. So with those words, Chair, I'm pleased to move the recommendation in my name and conclude simply by saying this is just to get the conversation started.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. Mr Belmar.
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to second this motion this evening and endorse the words of Mr Boardman that this is about starting a conversation. A draft concept master plan of the type that is being endorsed tonight is a fantastic opportunity for the community to be engaged in the planning of an area such as Bunjil, and I note that the visions for the precinct include a substantial increase in commercial floor space, high-density residential dwelling, a mix of private and public uses to help create a 24-hour activated precinct, high-quality public spaces, permeable, accessible pedestrian precinct. And that's really, they're just some of the issues that a conversation such as the one we're starting today can ferment. And it's important to realise the great opportunities that are available in the precinct and to ensure the best use of such valuable land in Casey with respect to the advantages that the community can gain from having a plan such as this, which identifies the kind of development that can occur. And just being clear about that, the plan shows, in effect, some different heights, different potential streets, different landscaping, and that's, as Mr Boardman has identified, it's to start a conversation about the sorts of buildings we might have there and the sorts of uses they might have in the future. It's a fantastic opportunity for a discussion about this important site, and I am happy to endorse and second this motion.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. I put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Item 5.4 is the Casey Growth Areas Payments from Reserves, December 2022. Is there a mover for the recommendation?
Yes, I'll move this.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. And a seconder?
Seconded, Chair.
Mr Boardman. Mr Belmar?
Thank you, Chair. This is in many respects a procedural motion. The recommendation is that Council authorises the Chief Executive Officer or Delegate to make payments generally in accordance with the Confidential Attachment 1 of this report and the Planning Environment Act 1987 and Subdivision Act 1988. To be clear, what we're moving tonight is a motion that takes into account that payments are required from our Contribution Plan Reserve and from the Public Open Space Contribution Reserve. I note that in anticipation of claims being made for the provision of public land and works associated with the contribution plan, and noting also that public open space contributions have been collected through the subdivision permit process. I've considered the confidential attachment, and I am satisfied that it is appropriate tonight to authorise the CEO or his delegate to make payments as required in accordance with statute. And with those comments, I am happy to move this motion.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. Mr Boardman?
Chair, likewise, I acknowledge I have reviewed the confidential attachment and it's consistent with our statutory obligations and for the reasons Mr Belmar has articulated, and for that I'm pleased to second the recommendation.
Thank you, I concur. Put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Item 5.5 is the procurement policy. Is there a mover for the recommendation on page 409?
Chair, I will move that.
Thank you, Mr Boardman.
I'm happy to second that.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. Mr Boardman?
Chair, I will not spend a great amount of time explaining the procurement policy. I will concentrate on the rationale for updating the policy and the principles contained within. Council, of course, is a significant purchaser of services and assets to conduct our vital community works and to ensure that we are meeting our obligations as an effective procurer of services and other assets. We need to ensure that we are providing all of those involved in the procurement process with clarity around their obligations and our expectations of them, based, of course, on the key principles which are contained within the policy itself, which are obtaining value for money, promoting open and fair competition, advancing economic, environmental and social objectives, and acting with integrity, probity and accountability. And only by having a clearly stated policy that provides a reference point for each level within the organisation around individual obligations and the requirements for those individuals to seek advice and or conduct open market processes. This cannot be achieved without a policy such as this. So the part of our suite of governance reforms to ensuring that the organisations and its policies and its other processes are fit for purpose and are meeting all of our statutory and best practice guidelines. This is an example of one which the CFO and her team have taken upon themselves to ensure that we are meeting those obligations, and they present this to us as a reform procurement policy that will take effect from the 1st of January this year, next year. So the two key changes to this is that there is clarification of the processes and conditions for exemptions from the requirement of the procurement policy, which was not clearly articulated in the previous policy. So there are times where thresholds around procurements do trigger an exemption, and in this new policy that is clearly articulated, and any affected officer now will have confidence around what their obligations and requirements are. And then conversely, there is an increase to request the quotation threshold. So we have provided further clarity on where we go to market, where we seek written quotes, where we obtain verbal quotes or other requirements under the Act to ensure that we are focusing our efforts and resources on higher value, higher risk, more strategically significant procurements, and not necessarily being bogged down with administrative processes that may not lead to better outcomes. This is not a document that requires external consultation because it does not have a significant impact on the community or stakeholders. It is something that has been extensively consulted internally with managers, with team leaders and operational staff to ensure that those affected individuals are very much aware of their obligations, and having reviewed the policy and its rationale and the reasoning for us conducting such an amendment, I am satisfied that it is absolutely best practice. It does meet the operational expectations of the organisation, and it also requires everyone affected by the procurement process to meet their statutory obligations quite clearly. With those words, I am pleased to move the recommendation and the new policy as put.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. Mr Belmar?
Thank you, Chair. Just some brief comments. It's appropriate that from time to time policies such as this are reviewed, and if appropriate, amendments are undertaken. I note that the amendments that are proposed clarify processes and secondly increase a request for quotation threshold. As Mr Boardman has clearly articulated, there has been internal review of this policy and consultation, and I am satisfied that in the proper exercise of our governance obligations, it's appropriate to adopt these changes and to always ensure that our policies are kept up to date and are user-friendly with respect to council staff, who are the ones who are required to use them on a day-to-day basis. So with those comments, I'm happy to move to second this motion.
Thank you, Mr Belmar, and thank you to our CFO who's brought some good thinking to our procurement policy, particularly with respect to the opportunities for innovation and continuous improvement. I'm also satisfied there are sufficient checks and balances present in the changes in processes. I'll put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Item 5.6, the disposal of 70 Volk Road, Cranbourne West. Is there a mover?
Yes, I'll move this.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. And a seconder?
Seconded, Chair.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. Mr Belmar.
Thank you, Chair. This is a procedural motion in many respects, but always an important motion when there is a disposal of land occurring. I note that in September 2022, Council resolved to commence the statutory process of disposing of land at 70 Volk Road, Cranbourne West. I've considered the title plan that's attached to this motion. I note that the resolution gives power to the CEO or his delegate by private treaty to sign and seal all documents associated with the sale of the land and to act generally on Council's behalf. I note that there was community engagement and that resulted in two engagements with members of the public, and the option that is recommended is to proceed with the sale of the subject land by private treaty to the adjoining landowner. And having considered the material and having considered the advice, I am satisfied that all the appropriate statutory steps have been taken and it's appropriate to proceed in the way that the recommendation provides. And with those comments, I'm happy to move this motion.
Thank you. Mr Boardman.
Chair, likewise, having reviewed the recommendations and the accompanying attachments and concurring with Mr Belmar's articulation of our statutory process, including obtaining a market valuation that is not more than 6 months old, that is included in a confidential document. We have complied to my satisfaction with our statutory obligations, and I'm pleased to second the recommendation as put.
Put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Item 5.7 is the variation to contract variation CT 000543 Package D, Browns Road, Active Open Space Reserve. Is there a mover for the recommendation on page 450?
Chair, I'll move the recommendation as put.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. And a seconder?
Yes, I'll second it.
Mr Belmar. Mr Boardman, would you like to speak to your motion?
Chair, I guess it's with a degree of coincidence that I'm moving this recommendation after recently and just previously moving the advised procurement policy, one of the requirements under our procurement policies and also under our instrument of financial delegations that if any contracts that are valued over $15 million need to be approved by us, being the council, this is one such contract by virtue of a variation as it relates to the allocated construction of Browns Road Active Open Space Reserve that has come to our attention due to unforeseen costs associated with raising the building, pad security improvements, structural steel changes to the pavilion, cladding additions to the pavilion, electrical lighting upgrades to the reserve, design changes necessitated by Melbourne Water as it relates to Christie's Drain A, laden condition claim for ground conditions as part of Melbourne Water Christie's Drain A section, and addition to linking footpath to comply with the Botanic Ridge Precinct Structure Plan. Having reviewed the rationale around the variation to the contract and the detailed analysis of the costs involved with that, I'm satisfied that processes have been conducted consistent with our procurement and statutory obligations. And do note, Chair, that this is not uncommon in the current economic environment. We are seeing not just an increase in costs from suppliers, but a number of suppliers that are already contracted with the council seeking variations because of costs associated with their own materials, procurement and supply chain issues. And we fully understand that that is not a situation that is unique to Casey. That is something that is affecting all municipalities around the state, if not the country, and is not showing any signs of abating irrespective of any revisions in economic indicators, particularly as it relates to the CPI rates. So we do note that there are processes in place under existing policies and future policies which we have adopted tonight to deal with such matters, and this is an example of appropriateness in such circumstances. So I'll move the recommendation as put.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. Mr Belmar?
Thank you, Chair. Likewise, I'm happy to second this motion, noting that this is, given the time we're in with respect to amendments to contracts, it's appropriate that this one occur. I've considered the material, I've considered the confidential attachment. I am conversant with the background and the reasons that are put forward with respect to costs that have been amended, and it's appropriate to adopt this motion, noting that it's unfortunate that we find ourselves in a situation where costs are increasing, but it is unavoidable in the current international climate. And with those comments, I'm happy to second this motion.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. I'll put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. And we have item 5.8, the Casey Planning Scheme Review. The Manager of Planning and Building has been very busy. There's many items this evening. So there is a recommendation, and do I have a mover?
Yes, I'll move it.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. Seconder?
Seconded, Chair.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. Mr Belmar?
Thank you, Chair. I note that the recommendation is that we endorse the Casey Planning Scheme Review 2022 report, which is an attachment. I note that in a comprehensive review of the planning scheme was completed in 2018. The Casey Planning Scheme, of course, being a statutory document, and the document which primarily guides planning decisions in the City of Casey. It sets out a framework of both the vision for Casey and also sets out zone requirements and overlays. And it's important that a document of that nature is always kept up to date and reviewed, and the report which is attached to the papers tonight tells us that the recommendations which have been made in the past, that a number of them are complete, a number of them are ongoing and underway. I note that a small percentage is planned but not yet commenced, but as always, planning schemes are they're organic documents. They are continuously changing, and the review we are endorsing tonight demonstrates the important work that's done by our strategic planners to ensure that the planning scheme is always kept up to date. And with those comments, I'm happy to move this motion.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. And sorry, to you, Mr Boardman.
Chair, thank you very much. It is quite a comprehensive review that was undertaken in 2018, followed up by more of a status report or updated review this year. That's sort of more of a hygiene report, I think we could describe it as Chair, but it does show that there is certainly progress being conducted against the recommendation of the Planning Scheme Review quite earnestly. Whilst Mr Belmar has articulated that this is an iterative document, there is always going to be changes, both legislative and through local community expectations and through other obligations, some of which we have discussed tonight. We need to be cognizant of ensuring that from a performance management perspective, we are reviewing such documents, particularly these live documents, and we're providing feedback and we are providing updates to the community on our own internal review to ensure that the community is informed as transparently as appropriate in the circumstances of how we are assessing our analysis amongst our stated requirements. An important update to this particular review scope is the alignment of the Casey Planning Scheme with the Council Plan 2021 to 2025 and our long-term council vision over 10 years. We acknowledge that there are some gaps in the planning scheme that will inform future strategic planning work program. We'll discuss some of those tonight, and we will discuss those that come to our attention appropriately and engage with the community as required. And of course, one of the key requirements of this review process is we do now write to the Minister for Planning, and we provide them a written report of our progress against the 2018 recommendations and explanations as to why progress has or has not been achieved. And that is clearly articulated in the very detailed report of 23 pages, which is commencing on page 463 of the council papers. So having reviewed that and being briefed by council officers, I'm satisfied that the progress is commensurate with expectations, and where those identified gaps have been referenced, there is contingencies and other processes in place to address those at an irrelevant point in the future. And we have our obligations to ensure that we are monitoring progress against planning scheme and all other aspects and issues that stem from it. We're providing feedback to council officers and are engaging with the community as appropriate to continue to input into this review process, as necessitated not just through the Planning Environment Act but also through our council engagement policy. So with those words, I'll move the recommendation, or second the recommendation as put.
Thank you. I will put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Item 5.9, appointment of independent members of the Audit and Risk Committee. Do I have a mover for the recommendation?
Chair, as the council delegate on the Audit and Risk Committee, I will move that recommendation.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. And a seconder?
Yes, I'll second that.
Mr Belmar. Mr Boardman.
And Chair, very briefly, this is to reappoint Ms Carol Pagnon and Mr Ernest Stabic as independent members to the Audit and Risk Committee, or ARC for short, for a further 3-year term which will end on the 31st of December 2025. We note that Mr John Nguyen is the current chair and his term continues until 31 December 2023, and we note that the committee has completed its annual review of our charter, and we are currently completing a review of our operations. I won't take the opportunity tonight to talk specifically as to the Audit and Risk Committee's outputs and activities over the last 12 months. We have done that at a previous opportunity, and we'll do that at the appropriate half-yearly check-in early next year. Suffice to say that the committee is working extremely studiously, ensuring that all of the aspects of best practice financial management and risk management and the audit function is meeting all obligations, and that the internal audit program for council activities over the next 3 years is looking at areas of improving operational efficiency, ensuring that we are meeting all of our obligations, statutory and through the community engagement processes, and that we are committing to the process and our mission to be a much more high-performing and efficiently operating organisation. This is not a position that I certainly take lightly. It is a significantly involved position, one that is very fortunate to have Mr Nguyen as its chair, supported by Mr Stabic and Ms Pagnon, and all of the council officers and our internal auditors, HLB, Man Judd and Vago, as our external auditors. And due to the comprehensiveness of the workflow program and previous reports, I trust the confidence is reciprocated at the community level, because my view is that we are operating through the utmost professionalism and good governance. And with that, those comments, I'm very pleased to move the recommendation.
Thank you, Mr Boardman. Mr Belmar.
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to second this motion and thank Mr Boardman for the work that he's done as Council's delegate on the Audit and Risk Committee. I note that it's appropriate that the 2 independent members be reappointed to a further 3-year term, and I thank them for the work they've done to date. I also want to acknowledge and thank the work of Mr Nguyen as chair, and I note his presentations to council at earlier meetings and his thorough work with all members of our Audit and Risk Committee in ensuring good governance at Council. It's important work that's undertaken by an Audit and Risk Committee in having that overview function and ensuring that we are performing always optimally when it comes to policies that govern how we work. It's work which involves having to review many hundreds of pages of material from time to time. It can be thankless work, and I want to thank those members who undertake this important work, not just on our behalf, but on behalf of the residents of the City of Casey. And with those comments, I'm happy to second this motion.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. I'll put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. Our final item this afternoon is item 5.10, which is the endorsement of the proposed governance local law for public exhibition, and that relates predominantly to the use of the common seal and offences and penalties. Is there a mover for the recommendation?
Yes, I will move this.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. Seconder?
Seconder, Chair.
Mr Boardman. Mr Belmar.
Thank you, Chair. In moving this motion, I note that it contains 6 parts, and in the background it sets out that this particular proposed law is required because of amendments to the Local Government Act and other council governance rules which have not, which have created effectively a carve-out, and we need a particular local law to deal with these 2 issues. One, the use of our common seal, and secondly, the sometimes unfortunate but necessary policy that deals with offences and penalties of persons who behave in an improper or disorderly manner at council meetings. I've considered the material and note that it also includes an assessment of the human rights impacts of adopting these policies. I note that there can be perhaps some jocularity around the fact that council still has a common seal, but it's appropriate to note that it is a fundamental document in the way that council does its business. We still continue to use it. It's appropriate that there be a policy as to how it's used, where it's maintained, and that a proper policy and proper direction is given to council staff as to its use. And with those comments, noting that we are putting this local law out to community engagement, I am happy to move this motion.
Thank you, Mr Belmar. Mr Boardman.
Chair, I won't elaborate on Mr Belmar's comments. Suffice to say, this is a very self-explanatory document that, as Mr Belmar has explained, uses the common seal, which although traditional and is a requirement under various statutes, is something which is quite important for the operations of the organisation, and also includes sections around offences for conduct at council meetings and infringement notices if such conduct is detected and requires action. Having reviewed the documents and the explanatory material, and by virtue of the fact that we are going to be releasing this for public consultation and before it returns to council for further adoption, likewise I am satisfied with the process and its compliance with other acts as Mr Belmar has articulated, and I'm pleased to second the recommendation.
Thank you. I'll put the motion to the vote. All in favour? Carried. That concludes our officer reports this afternoon. I move to item 6, which is consideration of reports of committees, and there's some detail in the agenda, so I simply note the record of discussion as listed in the agenda papers. Item 7 is petitions. There are no petitions listed for this council meeting. A petition was received after the agenda papers for the December meeting were published, and that petition will be tabled in 2023. Item 8 is urgent business. There's no urgent business for this afternoon's meeting. Item 9, closed council. There are no closed items for consideration. So it concludes our meeting today. It's an opportunity to say thank you to those members of the community who've participated in the many, many consultation processes that the council has undertaken throughout the year. Also to thank the council staff who do provide excellent support to us in our role and consistently are responsive to the many, 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 many questions that we raise with them with respect to the operation of council and the council meetings. So my final opportunity is to say Merry Christmas to everybody here, everybody who's listening, and look forward to our further work together as a community and a council in 2023. Good afternoon.